You have probably heard or said the phrase many times, shoulda, coulda, woulda. We use that a lot of times when we're dismissing hypotheticals or dismissing excuse making. It's easy to say things could have been different. It's easy to say that I would have behaved differently or chosen differently under different circumstances. We might lament a bad call at the end of a basketball game. If the ref would have called that a foul, we would have won. But he didn't. What does it matter what would have happened, what could have happened? It didn't happen. We might downplay someone else's achievements. Well, sure, this guy's a doctor, but I could have gone to med school. Well, even if we're allowing that that's true, I didn't. He did. Coulda, woulda, shoulda. They don't stand for much in the end. They don't really mean anything. That line of thought is basically saying, in another reality, this might have happened. My generation, and all those younger, I suppose, we've always had the multiverse as part of our fictional stories. Time travel or alternative dimensions, something like that. There's this common pseudo-scientific theory in movies and books and comics and games where each decision leads to its own separate universe, and there are just infinite of those, because think of how many decisions you've made in your life. So there's a world where I asked out Natalie Hernandez in the 9th grade, and things happened differently after that, and there's this world, of course, where I didn't. We didn't invent that in my generation. It's been around since at least the 1940s with George Bailey and It's a Wonderful Life. He sees this alternate thing that could have happened if he never lived. Charles Dickens wrote about it with Ebenezer Scrooge, seeing this alternative future in the Christmas Carol or A Christmas Carol, where this could be what happens if he does not change. I'm sure there would be others much older. But we're familiar with that idea of thinking about how things might have been, this entire other world, this entire other reality that might have been critically different if for one different decision. Well, an incredible thing about Scripture, or about the biblical portrayal of God, is that it truly presents God as omniscient, all-knowing. And this happens in a few different ways. One, we think, for instance, he has surpassing knowledge of everything right now. The number of hairs on your head, as well as the thoughts that are running through your head. They're not all head-related. He also knows the flight paths of all of the birds in the world, even the smallest, down to even a little sparrow. Complete passing knowledge of everything that is happening right now, all throughout the world. But of course, you could extend that timeline backwards. He knows all things that have happened because he existed before the beginning of anything. Think of the magnificence, I guess, in a passage like Genesis 1 and verse 1. In the beginning, God. In the beginning, someone is doing something. Nothing else could do anything because nothing else was. So stretch it all the way back as far as you can into the past, and God has this surpassing knowledge of everything. And biblically, you could move that as far forward as you wish, into the future, because he claims and demonstrates a knowledge of what things will happen. I've always loved the phrasing in Romans 4 and verse 17, that he calls those things which do not exist as though they did. That's where Paul is talking about his ability to speak of things in the present tense that had not happened yet. Why can he do that? Because he's God. He knows what will happen or won't. But this omniscience, this surpassing knowledge of everything, takes on extra significance when we return to our idea of could have, the things that might have been. Because a God with complete knowledge of past and present and future can be taken seriously when he instead speaks about what could have been. When that sort of side door of time is opened up and a glimpse is given of what was once possible, well, then we have no reason to doubt. If he knew what would happen before it happened, it makes sense that he would know what else might have happened that simply didn't. And we see God speaking in exactly these terms on several occasions. This is what could have been. If you want to know, or if Israel wanted to know how things would have been different if only they'd taken door number 1 instead of door number 2, well, God answers that question. Consider the 81st Psalm as a sort of representative case. Psalm 81, beginning in verse 13. Here the psalmist is speaking for God, and he says, "Oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways. I would soon subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their foes. Those who hate the Lord would cringe toward him, but their fate would last forever. But he would feed you with the finest of the wheat, and with honey from the rock I would satisfy you." That, the psalmist says, and God says, that's what he wanted. That's what could have been. And it isn't just bluster, of course. The same way, to use any of the examples earlier, we might talk about things we coulda, woulda, shoulda, that we might have been able to do if only I was a completely different person. This isn't God just speaking in hypotheticals, trying to make something more of himself. Earlier, the psalmist has already mentioned that the people had called in trouble and had been delivered by God. That's in verse 7. So he's demonstrated already that he's capable. But that deliverance was contingent upon their response. And they chose something else, he says. This could have been the case. It's what he wanted to be the case. Now, quick comparison with our preferred method in similar situations. What 4 words do we like to use when we find ourselves in the position that God is really in this case? I told you so. You're suffering, you have some bad thing going on, you picked the wrong door, and now you're in deep, now you're miserable. That's when so many of our chipper, helpful, miserable people like to come and chime in and say, "Told you so. You brought this on yourself. I told you so." And of course, we usually insist on lying by saying, "I hate to say I told you so." And that's a lie because a lot of us really love to say, "I told you so." We like that feeling of being vindicated. Even if the outcome is bad, well, hey, at least I was right. I mean, you might be in a bad time. I might be suffering even as a result of it, but I was right and you were wrong. But this 81st Psalm isn't just God telling Israel, "I told you so. You should have listened to me." This passage and the others like it, some of which we'll look at this morning, this is recorded for their benefit, but I think especially ours, because these passages fill in the rest of the story. They tell us everything else that is going on. Yes, of course, he did tell them so. And in that case, I suppose it would be appropriate to even say such a thing. I told you so. I warned you. He did warn them. This bad outcome that they're experiencing, it's exactly what he tried to tell them about to avoid scenarios just like this. But the primary point from this passage is that it is so bad for them right now, primarily because it could have been really, really good. You think of the key difference. Usually we just dwell on the bad outcome, that "I told you so" that I'm mentioning. Usually we bring that out when the only choices were between bad and neutral, or bad and nothing. When you reach a certain age and you start asking questions like, "I wonder if I can still touch rim on a basketball goal," or "I wonder if I can still do something," whatever else it is, whatever athletic feat, touch your toes or do the splits or something like that, and you reach, I don't know, let's ballpark 43 to pick a number out of a hat, and you start asking questions like that of yourself, or you start pondering those things with your spouse or something like that, that's when you want someone with better sense around to say, "No, you can't and you shouldn't try. You're going to hurt yourself. You're going to tear every ligament in your knee. You're going to do some irreparable harm to your body. You don't have anything to prove. You can't do it anymore. Don't try." But if you insist on trying it, and you're down on the ground holding your back or your knee or whatever it is, they might stand by and say, I told you so. But in those cases, what if you'd listened to them? Nothing would have happened. You didn't miss out on anything great. Just nothing would have happened. If only you hadn't tried to jump like you did 20 years ago, all your needs for the rest of your life would have been met. And you'd have happiness and success beyond your imagination. All of your best friends and family would have jumped out of the bushes and thrown you a surprise ice cream party. It would have just been the most wonderful day ever if only you didn't try to do that. Well, no, the only thing that was at stake was do it or not, and the only outcome would be bad. The only good outcome would be, well, I didn't try it. Just nothing would happen. And what good does that accomplish to say after the fact, I told you so? It annoys the listener, but practically speaking, not much else. So why is God telling Israel, here's what could have been? It primarily serves, I believe, to focus the reader, to focus the listener, to focus us on the basic disposition of God's will towards us. That what could have been, that what would have been, had only they chosen differently, would have been wonderful, would have been to their benefit, would have provided everything that they needed. Consider some further examples here, and they all share this idea in common. Think of Deuteronomy 5 and verse 29. This is in the midst of a sort of recap of the law, and there in Deuteronomy 5, Moses is reminding the people of what things were like when he first received the law, and he mentions how terrified they were, how frightened they were, how reverent towards God they were in those days when they first received the law. And God said to Moses, speaking of Israel at that time, oh, that they had such a heart in them that they would fear me and always keep all my commandments, that it might be well with them and their children forever. Wouldn't that be good? Wouldn't that be a good outcome? We know that isn't what happened. Moses knew already by that time that that isn't what happened. But wouldn't it have been great? That's the possible future. That's what could have been. That's what God wanted. And it's good. Think of the words David hears from the prophet Nathan. 2 Samuel chapter 12. This is, of course, after his sin with Bathsheba. And God, through Nathan, reminds him, after listing all that he had given to David, he says, I've given you everything. Everything has turned out in your favor. I've blessed you with so much. I've made you king. He's been with David since he was so small. But after listing all those things that he has provided, all that he has accomplished through David already, he says, and if that had been too little, I also would have given you much more. You've already experienced some of how good it could be, and it could have just kept going. Could have just continued that way in your life indefinitely. Nothing would have been withheld from you. You only had to keep doing what you were doing. You only had to ask. That's what God wanted. And it's good. You think of Jesus addressing Jerusalem, the city itself. Matthew records it in Matthew 23. Luke does so in a different context in Luke chapter 13. I don't know whether they had their own reasons for offering a different chronology or if this happened on two occasions. I don't know. But in both cases, the sentiment is the same. Jesus looking at a city that was not much longer for the world, so to speak, in a generation that would be destroyed, largely as judgment, as ultimate punishment for what they were doing to Jesus and to all of the prophets who had come before. But look at that second phrase there, that second sentence. How often would I have gathered your children together, as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were not willing. You could have avoided disaster. You could have enjoyed fellowship and participation with Christ. Here is the Son of God come to the earth. You could have welcomed him. You could have embraced him. You could have allowed him to bring you in. You could have been a part of that from the very beginning. That's what Jesus wanted. And it's good. Or God speaking once again to the nation in Isaiah 48. Isaiah 48, beginning in verse 18. Oh, that you had heeded my commandments. Then your peace would have been like a river, and your righteousness like the waves of the sea. Your descendants also would have been like the sand, and the offspring of your body like the grains of sand. His name would not have been cut off nor destroyed from before me. That's what Jehovah wanted, and it's good. Now, that last example highlights something even further. Because if you look in Isaiah 48, you can turn to that chapter if you want, sort of flip through it. Isaiah 48 is in the context of redemption. The whole section is laying out God's design for Judah. Specifically, that he would rescue them, he would recover them. They were being spread out, they were going to be carried away captive to Babylon, and he mentions Babylon by name there in Isaiah 48, the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. And he says, I'm going to bring you out of that. I'm going to restore you. I'm going to redeem you. That's what he says in verse 20. The Lord has redeemed his servant Jacob. So there he's already telling them as well that, yes, they had chosen poorly, but he would relent, he would show mercy, and he would save. But even within the context, the fact that God would show his grace doesn't mean that it couldn't have been even better. Now, I find this an important consideration for us. I assume other generations, other eras of time have had this same concern, but I so often hear ideas like, whether they are used with this pithy phrase or not, all the time it kind of boils down to the same idea: better to ask forgiveness than permission. You've heard this before. And you've seen people who seem to live by this model of life. Or when some people would look at a parable like Matthew 20, the parable of the vineyard workers, and seemingly use that as a good blueprint for life. Take the wrong conclusion from that parable. If you remember that story, Jesus tells, it's this man hiring workers for his field, for his vineyard, and he goes and he hires some to work for 12 hours. The entire day they've got to deal with the noontide heat and all of this, and some work for 9 and some work for 6, and some just come in the last hour of the day and they only work a little bit. And he gives the first group of guys 12-hour workers. He gives them a denarius, a day's wage, fair pay. It was what they agreed upon. But they're upset because they had first seen that he gave those men who worked 1 hour a denarius, a day's wage. So when it came their time to receive the payment, they're thinking by now, well, I mean, we get 12, right? 1 hour gets you 1, 12 hours should get you 12. But a lot of people, I think, look at this parable and start thinking, boy, if I can find out a way to be that 1 hour guy, that's the smart way to do it. If you can figure out how to do whatever else you want in life and just kind of slide in right there at the end, do your 1 hour and get your day's pay. That's what you want to do. Game the system. Many of us go through life, I'm afraid, with the attitude that we can fix things, we can fix everything later. We can have our cake and eat it too. And that as long as we make it in before that last breath, then it all turned out okay. But what these passages, some of them that we've been looking at this morning, point out is that if we are truly living by the will of God, we should instead be considering how good it could truly be. How many things he desires to do for us. He is urging us to look for excellence and consistency in our relationship with him. It may be that you can live a mostly wasted life, spiritually speaking, and still somehow end up in eternity with Christ. I'm obviously not the final arbiter of that. I don't know exactly who will be there and who will not. Let's say, for the sake of argument, you can do, as we've just been saying, and avoid anything good and noble and excellent and worthy in your life, and yet through the grace of God, come to Him in that last hour. Be there with Him in the end. But you would know regret for a life like that, if you have any wisdom about you. And you would have to be aware of what could have been, of all that Christ could have accomplished through you, of the good that you could have done for your family, for others, for people who rely upon someone to do good in this world, of the greater potential you could have fulfilled. That's why God reveals His will, why He reveals what He wants, what He desired, what He wanted to do, willed to do, would have done for them and for us. Because He wants us to seek that out all the time. No matter how much time we may or may not have left, it is incumbent upon us, again, if we have any wisdom to us whatsoever, to begin right now, early in the day, to pursue the will of God. We would hate to reach the end of a life and think, well, I suppose it has turned out in the end. I know the Lord, but I did nothing useful with life up until the end. Could have brought other people to Him. I didn't. Could have taught my children to seek the Lord. I didn't. I could have been useful to other people, but wasn't. I could have accomplished much, but didn't. And to have to think then what could have been. Seek out the best while you can, while it is still today. Strive for a life that honors God, that puts Him at the forefront, that tries to accomplish what we know it is that He wants. Maybe these passages have shown us some of what that is. Ultimately, we have discovered, if nothing else, that what He wants is what is best for us. This morning, we offer an opportunity while we do have the time. If you need to become right with God, you need to be on the same page as Him. The biblical term is reconciliation. You need to be reconciled to God. That is only available, that is only possible through Christ. If you have not already taken advantage of it, you need to be baptized into Christ, avail yourself of His sacrifice, the blood that He shed on our behalf. You do that through a likeness of His death, His burial, His resurrection. You can do that this morning. You need our prayers, you need our encouragement as you try to do what it is that God wants, what could be, what would be if He had His will. You need our prayers and our strength in that regard. We're willing and able to do that as well today. But we urge all of you, I urge all of you, I urge for myself, desire for myself, that we give our first attention and our fullest attention to what it is God truly wants from our lives. He doesn't merely want people who come to church every once in a while. He doesn't merely want people who will say a prayer before a meal and have that be enough. He doesn't merely want people who go through motions, who say the right thing at the right time, but who for the rest of their lives give very little regard to what He wants. He wants people who pursue the things of God, who pursue the will of God, who try to make their mind into His mind. That is what we strive for. To please God and to model ourselves after our Lord in everything that we do. And so we encourage you as you leave this place, strive for that. Do that. With every chance that you have, with every choice presented, don't find yourself regretting later what could have been. If only I had been more diligent. Make the correct decisions now. If we can help you in any way this morning, we're ready to do so. Come forward if you would while we